So I don't think I got this because
Okay, the second part. Okay,
I'll tell you what I'm thinking about.
sure.
So, well, I'll tell you what I understood from this and then what I'm thinking. So, when we speak of someone, excuse me, when we speak of someone with a who does not have a standard or a moral principles for evaluating actions,
Yes.
then there's no, if he doesn't have a standard, then he doesn't have a way to evaluate, because evaluation
Correct.
is judgment presupposing some standard. That's what you're saying. That's what I understood.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. But what I was thinking of was a scenario where someone does have knowledge of moral principles. Like
Okay,
they've got a code
got
of
it.
values, a set of moral principles. They've got a standard. We'll just say they've got an objectivist standard, and they're thinking about stealing bread. So in that case, what I understood Peikoff's passage to be saying is that in that situation where someone does have moral principles, but then chooses to act against them, he cannot evaluate the piece of bread as an object, what its value is in relation to him. He can, using that standard. It's the object is a blank, a cognitive blank, in the same way that
Yes, that's
a
right.
proposition accepted on faith is a cognitive blank. You just
Right.
evaluate the method.
Hmm.
And so in that case, it's only his method that he can evaluate. He can say, okay, this is against my moral code and it's bad, but he can't evaluate the bread as good or bad. Is that, and did I understand this correctly? And how does it fit? How does what you're saying fit in with that situation where someone does have knowledge of a moral code?
Okay, I think that is maybe a valid interpretation. The way I'm taking it is taking a further step to say that if you don't have that means to evaluate, I don't think you would have the means to evaluate the method either.
Right,
Like that, even that's a blank.
right.
But it's a minor point, I think. I think you get the general idea, and you could argue that point as more the correct one. I think we both understand what it would mean to say to not have a method either. So I don't
Yeah,
think it's a misunderstanding as much as that's why I said I'm not sure it makes sense. It's not like saying you're wrong. It's not like I see what you're saying, but I don't think I agree. It might be valid if you argue it out, but I do think you had the general idea. I was just making sure you understood the distinction between like I think you understood it, but just I was making sure you understood the distinction between the perspective of the person judging, because that's sometimes easy to overlook or miss. You're trying because you don't want
right.
to judge from an omniscient stand. You want to judge from the center of an individual or from someone's
Right.
perspective always. It's never
Yeah.
in the omniscient perspective. So as long as you get
That's
that, I think you get the overall point.
that's how I interpreted the original passage,
Yes.
and that's why I found it interesting, because I
Okay.
was that's what confused me. It was, can you have a situation where you have, let's say, you can you have a situation where you can't evaluate an object, like, okay, I want this car, or I want this bread, or I want this soup, or I want this toothbrush, I don't know,
Right.
anything, where you can't evaluate an object. What was the original passage that it's, if you act against it, you can't evaluate the object. Can That's what
Essentially. Yeah.
I was originally caught up in, because it just seemed strange to me originally that you couldn't, like, it lead I was confused on how can you say something is a cognitive blank when you act against a moral standard? Like, shouldn't you say it's bad? And so the distinction I wasn't able to make then, which I think I'm able to make now, is that there's a difference between evaluating the method and the object. And that's what I got caught up in. I was like, how can you say you can't
Yes.
evaluate it? But then thinking of it further, I realized, okay, so it's, you can't evaluate the object, but you can only evaluate the method with a standard. That's what I was caught up
Yes.
on.
As long as you have the standard, then you could judge something.
Got it.
And if you
Okay.
don't even have the principle, then well, that's one type of standard
It's
that
all
you're
applied.
not using.
Right. Okay. Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah, when I write things
Reply
like
there.
that's usually, I think doing philosophy is usually a matter of how do you guide the questioning in a way that's
Yes.
productive. It's less about the answer as much as what are the types of things we need to be thinking about to get at a reasonable or rational answer,
Mhm.
or at least understanding. Even if it's different, at least we're operating on similar standards of rationality and what counts as rational, what counts as what are the things that we need to understand to come to an answer.
Right. It's still, even though I get that distinction now,
Yeah.
that Leonard Peikoff was pointing out, it's still somewhat abstract in that it's hard for me to okay, I get that there's a distinction between the object and the method, but then my mind is saying, okay, so what? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, I get the passage now,
Yes.
but it's still somewhat abstract.
So what? Yes.
Yeah.
But so what's always the hard part? I find that always the hard part. Like, why does
Yeah.
it matter? Well, I think a lot of that is finding those examples, or even just trying to apply it to a question in your life, even if you're not sure it even matters. Just try it out and just see if it can apply.
I suspect the so what is linked to the fact that I can't necessarily project or concretize the negative impact of any one thing that I do. And so, like, for example, if I've determined and proven that theft does not let me become the kind of person I want to be, then it's hard to evaluate, like, okay, what this car that I stole, let's say, it's hard to evaluate. It's impossible to look at it in isolation. I think it's in that direction of, like, you can't concretize any given action that goes against the principle and how it ends up being bad for you. And so you can only look at the method and what that does as opposed to the specific thing you acquire. But I'd need more.
Yes.
I'd need to chew through it more anyway to make it better. Okay.
Yes. That sounds right.
Have you read any Viktor Frankl? I think I asked you this ages ago.
I still haven't, but I read his Wikipedia page by now.
Right.
Yeah,
So
I read about him.
I was thinking about this after reading his book and experiences in the concentration camp he was in Auschwitz. And he said for him, it was, so there were, I think, I can't remember exactly, but there were a few meanings. So I think one meaning was his work and his wife. And it turns out his wife didn't survive. I'll see if I can find the original quote. And for a lot of people, it was God. Like, they still believed in God during their experience. And that's what kept them alive, in the sense that they saw something worth staying alive for. Like, even if they were suffering with meaning and purpose. Actually, Nietzsche has a quote: "He who has a why can survive anyhow."
Yeah.
And it got me thinking about that, because in that context, like, you actually do not, it's impossible even to have the meaning of work. Like, he would have lost his papers, and then his work, he wouldn't have anything to keep on going. He'd want to, like, rationally, it would make sense to just, and I would get someone choosing to end their life in that context, because you can't, like, I don't see how you can, it's impossible to be happy. You're just miserable and you don't know how long it's going to last for. But it got me thinking about, like, well, there were people who suffered, and they suffered with meaning because they held on to this, even if, I don't believe in God, but they held on to this meaning that was, we could just say it was arbitrary, but it got them through. And then they maybe went on to have good lives. And so, whereas someone who was, like, didn't believe in God would have just said, okay, well, it's rational for me to end my life. And so I better just, they wouldn't have made it through. And I don't know, I just thought about, like, what if you don't have anything? Yeah, it's hard. Like, is it the case that something that they held on to, which was arbitrary, is actually what let them survive? Was a rational person in that context wouldn't have survived because he had nothing to hold on to. It's all just destruction and death. But it did end. You can't anticipate that rationally, right?
About anticipating, but
I don't know
I
if
think
do you get what I'm asking? Like, with this, it's weird to read about. I'll see if I can find a quote that maybe.
I mean, it sounds like you're trying to understand why they would uphold a belief that would seem arbitrary, yet it helps them survive something horrible and absolutely horrible in their lives, and they make it through. It would seem that if it were irrational, it would be the opposite. Like it would make it harder, or would it make a difference? Is that what you're asking?
Yes. Look, I just pasted the original question that I
Okay.
found after reading that book. I'm going to see if I can
Yeah.
find more.
Yeah. The way I think of this is more general than it is about their belief in God. I try to generalize it further than that because clearly we know atheists can survive the same thing too. I mean, I'm not sure if they survive better or worse, but we can know that they survive too. It's not like
Right.
they're the religious people are the only ones who could find meaning through this pain. Even Nietzsche is pretty unreligious and he could find meaning in the pain, so to speak.
Right.
I
Right.
think it's more
Okay.
to do with finding a unifying understanding to the purpose of your life, a purpose to life beyond just doing the work or just going through the motions. That when you're going through the motions, that's not enough. That's not what characterizes life. I mean, that characterizes maybe existing. But what does it mean to be a human? What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to live? It's not just those things. It's a wider process than that one. It's a holistic process. It includes your emotions, it includes your thinking, includes mental health, psychological health, and the reason you do things, which that kind of holistic attitude is more Aristotelian. That's very much like Rand too, because she tries to think in the entirety of your well-being, not just like you do some specifics correct, but what integrated way do you think about your life? And sometimes God can help give an integrating force, at least. It gives you motivation to integrate your life, integrate it beyond simply the daily motions into something.
Right. Right.
I don't like to say wider than yourself, but a complete notion of yourself as a complete entity, not as some parts, but as the entirety, as an individual in your entirety. That being is a certain way of doing, in that this kind of Aristotelian, even Randian sense. Rand is even bigger on, I think, about doing things, whatever it might be, like going through the activities of life. Seems to be really something Rand emphasizes in particular. But going through those activities is kind of a way that we live out our natures, that living out our natures itself a meaning, because that's what the reason for living is, life itself. That its own ends, being the productive ends towards living, creates that fulfillment, even if it might be difficult in this situation. If you're doing the things that make you human, like reasoning things out and attaining things or valuing things, then you could feel like you're having meaning in that deeper sense than just going through the motions, that your work is just a means to an end. But it's not what does it mean to be living? What is your nature? Like your nature is not just having a rational mind, but using it, taking advantage of it. It's not because it's a process. It's not, your life is a process. It's not an object you have. And it's people that think of life as some kind of process, whether it's God's process or a human process, they're still thinking of it as a totality. And that's what pushes them on, I think.
That's interesting. I didn't think about the sentiment behind a statement like doing something bigger than yourself or doing something beyond. I don't know exactly what the wording is, beyond yourself, greater than yourself. Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't make the connection between that and living an integrated life. Maybe that's what the feeling that you get when you live,
Yeah.
when all your values are integrated and you're working towards one abstract end that's clear to you. That's interesting.
Yeah.
And then
I think that's what Rand would call happiness in her understanding. That's that process, that attaining that end or moving towards that end is flourishing, is happiness.
okay, I think I've got my wording right in my mind now. So basically, I could imagine someone in the situation that Viktor Frankl was in. And as an atheist, you're meaning comes from let's say your work, your love, and I don't know what hobbies, something else that are somehow integrated, but in a concentration camp, none of those are values anymore. Let's say you weren't married and you didn't have hope that maybe your wife has survived and you would meet her at the end of it. Like you have nothing to pursue anymore versus someone who maybe is in the same situation and neither of you can see an end to this, but that person says, okay, well, I'm going to suffer in a way I'm going to turn this tragedy into triumph and suffer in a dignified way or something like that for God. And so they survive and they end up getting through the Holocaust and then they go on to live a normal life. Whereas the atheist, in my mind, just would have had to commit suicide. I mean, you gave examples where that's not the case, like Nietzsche, but that when I read this, that's the feeling I got in this book. It just seems like I started questioning the viability of rational or atheistic values in this context only. Like in that, how do you even, I wouldn't even know how someone could get through that except unless they're holding on to some irrational belief that gets them through the whole thing. I think that's what I was puzzled in originally. Maybe I can't exactly, because it's hard for me to imagine what the mental state of each person would be and how that, but yeah, that's what I got when I read this book, the thought.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I think the key to surviving, well, even not even just the Holocaust, is, let's just say, a very depressing situation that it's not like your life is going to end any day, but it's miserable nonetheless, and you wish it would end. How do you just get through that without being depressed? I think it takes a similar attitude, like about an abstract end that you're going towards. That's
right.
An end that's defined by your nature.
Right.
Which is a very abstract thing to say. Life is the end in itself. I mean, that's a complicated ethical integration, but if you can reach that state, then you could find that way of finding value in the abstract, or in a way that you can act towards it, not just think about it, but actually take action towards it, and that can give you meaning.
Right.
And an objective meaning too, because that's an end that you go towards by nature, or what your nature as a human demands. And if you do that, then you will attain some sort of happiness or comfort, or whatever word makes most sense to you.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. And like you pointed out, maybe Nietzsche can give some insight into.
Yeah, I think he's good at that. And I think Rand is good at it too. Like, I like what Aristotle says about it, but I think Rand words it much better. Like, Aristotle has his own word for that. Like, he called it being at work, staying itself. Entelechia is a very weird word, but it just means that you're living by your nature and acting it out. And that's what you are by nature. It's not like you're becoming something else. That's living up to your potential in a way that you're actualizing what you are, who you are by your nature.
I didn't
It's
get
doing it.
Sorry.
Well, Aristotle thought of it as actualizing your nature,
right,
as doing your nature in the fullest sense. And Rand would, I guess, would say that's an integrated way of thinking about your life. And I think Rand is clearer about it. She makes the point clearer.
So, yeah, mate. Yeah, I need to think about it more, but I got the impression from Rand that, like in this situation, I wouldn't, like, I was just thinking of myself in that situation. I wouldn't survive, because it's like just projecting like what you even hold on to. I still, even with, it's just hard, like, to take Viktor Frankl's approach, which in some sense might be less rational, or might not be rational if I just start believing God. Not that I could make myself, but that seems like that would, you might say, okay, well, it's rational in that situation not to choose to live, but then what if it does end and you can't project that? Like, you don't know. You don't know what happens in the future. It's very hard to project into the future. Like I think when people speak to someone suicidal, they always just tell them, try to take it a day at a time, because everyone, when they're in a certain depressed state, it's often not always, but it depends on the circumstance, but there's often the experience of you, this is how you feel now, but then, it changes in the future. Like you don't know what happens in the future, what unfolds, what new things come up. And so it's similar to Frankl, something to keep you going day by day, versus maybe if you had an integrated, concretized understanding of what Rand's
Yeah,
philosophy would look like in that situation, it would be different. But
I
I don't.
think
So it was hard for me to project it.
it is hard. I think a lot of this comes from some degree of personal experience. Whoever
Right.
it is thinking about these, that you need that personal experience to be. I mean, even Rand had that by living through the
We the living.
Russian Revolution.
Right.
I mean, like she went through it to some extent, not the Holocaust, obviously, but horrifying enough that it profoundly affected her life.
Yeah.
Or anybody that say has had cancer or severe illness, they would know too.
Yes.
Or somebody died in their life. Usually, you need those severe things to really be able to know what does it mean to get through it. What actually have you lost? And how do you change your attitude once you're to get through it?
Yeah.
Which is very hard to project, even or
Yeah.
even think about. You just in a way you just need to experience it to know.
I think that Jordan Peterson is very popular, and I think part of his appeal is actually now that I think about it, it's this similarity of like, here we go, the to transform personal tragedy into triumph and achievement. So
Yes.
people, for him, for Rand, suffering is an exception and an accident. For him, for Jordan
Yeah.
Peterson, I don't know if this is an accurate characterization, but it's my impression. For him, suffering is a norm, and
Yeah.
the human power is to turn that into triumph, just as Nietzsche did or Viktor Frankl did. And so that's part of the appeal that he has. But it's not, yeah, I don't know how much of it is, it's different from Rand's, right? It's not the same thing.
I think she usually says it that way, that like suffering is an exception. But I'm not sure if her writing plays out that way, despite her saying that.
Right.
Like We the Living or Atlas Shrugged is like Atlas Shrugged is pretty negative through a lot of it. Like a lot of it is suffering when I think about it. If you think of Dagny, it's like she's gone through a lot of pain and she triumphs in the end. I mean, maybe in the end, Rand is saying that like suffering is the exception. That's what you can get by. It's not, I mean, they will occur. Suffering will occur, but doesn't mean it's normal or regular. That because it's not regular, we will
Yeah.
triumph always. You can always triumph because it's not the standard of what happens.
Yeah, it's something I'm gonna write about at some point later too. This view of her view of suffering, but
then tragedy itself, like We the Living, there is no happiness in the end because
right,
that's what makes it a tragedy. Everyone
right,
dies.
to
So I
show
don't know
that.
how she deals
Yeah,
with that.
but it goes back to your quote from Aristotle. What does a man need to live to his potential? One of the
Yeah,
conditions I remember was a society, the right kind of society.
right. That's one of them. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see what we got here. I'm just going through it and thinking about it. I'm actually not that clear on how she got from, like, it doesn't, I don't get how she got from rationality. Okay, so you get to the point where you say man's basic means of survival is his reason.
Yes.
And then, so I think that's from epistemology. Oh no, epistemology validates reason. It says reason is your source of knowledge. It's your only
Yes.
means of knowledge, and it's valid. And then you survive through your knowledge. So then ethics will go, okay, well then that means you must hold reason as your value. I'm speaking very broadly. Ethics says, okay, so in that case, if that's your only means of knowledge and you survive through your knowledge and, going through all that stuff like, okay, your means of survival, life is an end in itself, then you survive through your reason. Reason is your highest value. I don't get how you then get from that to like carving out these different virtues of like, well, independence. He says it's a redundancy. This is out of context. He's saying strictly speaking. So he's obviously going on to speak about independence. This is from what was that? The book that I got this from is Vision of Ayn Rand.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So then, okay. So then I do have that question of like, do you know how then they got from, how do you get from reason is your highest value to then carving out all these different aspects of like, and validate that that's what, how do you know that you've got the right aspects and which ones there are and so on? Like, what, have you given that much thought?
No, I'm not sure where they would have gotten it exactly, except from a general analysis of words people use
Okay.
for that acknowledge valuable character traits.
Right.
I don't think it's like they came up with, divided everything up and then figured things out. It seems more like a common sense way of approach where you just take some existing words and see what work as generally integrating forces, or because sometimes the words we know are, they do have some validity. We don't need to start from scratch always. We can take some concepts we already have, look at our ethical concepts and distinguish those and see how they connect to this wider value, see if there's distinctions coming from rationality or the distinctions coming from somewhere else. Because really your words aren't like always totally detached. I mean, on some level your words have convey an understanding of reality. You can be totally detached.
Yeah, I agree.
So you can see how different words connect, see how they break down. And going through there, I think you could, it seems like that's what Rand would have done, because I've never really seen her like argue that, oh, this is the observations I derived it from. It always seems more like, here are some words that we use commonly. And they seem to be broken up from this wider concept of rationality. Right. That by breaking it up, we can understand the detail of what it means to be rational, without having to deal with thousands of concretes at one time, or only dealing with rationality and missing all the concretes.
Yeah. Okay. I'm thinking about this too right now. Yeah, okay. So I guess I was thinking about, okay, on the one hand, I understand if you're saying independence is a kind of rationality, then if you're not rational, then if you're not rational, then you're not independent. But it's also confusing because then I think, okay, well, it's bizarre for me to say like, okay, well then I'm dependent. If I'm not independent, then I'm dependent. But what am I dependent on exactly? In this virtue, like if this is actually independence, if independence is being rational, then what would it mean? What exactly would I be dependent on if I was irrational?
My first thought is, does it have to be an opposite? I mean, does it have to be the opposite spectrum of independence dependent? I mean, could there be three terms?
I thought they're mutually exclusive.
Well, they seem to be on the same scale of measurement. One is just the opposite of the other. That's what I mean. But do they need to be opposites? I mean, I'm not saying that they're not opposite, but is the opposite of independence literally dependence necessarily? Or could it be a third thing?
What would that third thing be?
like the opposite of depression, or the opposite of, trying to think of an example.
Well, it depends what you mean by opposite, but
Well, somebody could say that's,
can you be something that is either not dependent and not independent? Like, is there such a thing as something in between which is not either?
well, I was
can't
trying to think in terms of like somebody could, well, I can't think what term I'm using. Someone could be excited doesn't mean the opposite of excited is, can't think of a good example. Like being apathetic is the opposite of being passionate. It's not being like loving and hating are opposites. It's more like that loving and antipathy is the problem. Like they're not strictly opposites. Like it doesn't have to be opposites on the same. But then I don't know how to phrase it.
It's okay.
But do you see what I'm saying?
Well, for some things, I think maybe it's true. Like the opposite of black isn't green, for example. Like there's no,
Right.
it doesn't have an opposite. There's colors, but I don't know if, because there, in terms of your basic way of acting, there's two ways. You either act rationally or you act irrationally, and they're mutually exclusive because you can either
Right.
exercise a process of reason,
Right.
or you
In that
can
case, I agree.
choose not to. So in that case, there it's a mutually exclusive option. And so I I thought in this case, in the case of independence, it was as well, and it makes sense given that it's a derivative of rationality. But then I don't know what it would mean to be, if he's saying to substitute an emotional evasion for a thought is to renounce independence, which makes sense given the definitions here.
Yes.
And let's say it's an analyzed emotion. I think that's key because you can act on emotion as long as you know what it's based. Like, if it's something you've thought out before and you've coded into yourself, like I really love eating chocolate or something like that, and you've thought it out. And
Yes.
I mean, there's a distinction to be made, right? It doesn't mean obviously, it's not like just because you like chocolate and you don't know why it's irrational. That's not what's being captured here. But it's like making a decision on the basis of an unanalyzed emotion would be an example of irrationality. Within not within a framework that you've chosen to. For example, you just say, all right, I'm taking 4 hours to just do anything. That's not irrationality. But in this case, he's talking about that where you make that decision on the basis of an unanalyzed emotion, and he's saying that's dependence. But then what? Well, actually, what would it mean for it to be dependence? Like, what would you be dependent on? Is what I was
I mean,
confused by.
did he claim that that's a form of dependence to substitute an emotion?
Actually, he didn't. I think he just said it's renouncing one's independence. But I assume if you do, I thought they're mutually exclusive. So if you do that, then you're dependent. But then I was like, okay, well,
I'm not sure.
Okay,
I never really worked that out.
I'm gonna.
Because in some sense, when you're being dependent, you're still thinking to a degree. Because you're still selecting like, oh, I'm going to go by their thinking instead. Like it's like secondary.
Okay, but that I would say in this context that might be a kind of dependence, right?
Yeah.
If you're going by someone else's judgment, but then
Yeah, and then just even further away from thinking, it's just substituting emotion. Or like you could even, if you want to use others to think for you, that's pretty close to substituting an emotion for thoughts. Or I mean, it's just further and further from accepting your own thoughts, like further and further away until you're not even using your own thought.
Okay.
Until you're like not even using thought, period.
Maybe that's
like
what
the
it
opposite
is.
of independence is like none of your own thoughts, and not even other people be the worst kind.
Right.
That's how I would analyze it, because it's not good just to go by opposites. Like, oh, if you're not independent, you're dependent. Well, yes, it's partly true, but are there different ways to be even dependent? What is dependency capturing? That's more or less not the acting with regard to your life. That's the problem. It's the abandonment of your own judgment. And the further away you are from your own judgment, the less independent you are.
Got it.
Until you're not at all independent.
That makes sense. Yeah, okay.
Maybe it's something like you can be right or wrong, or then not even wrong because it's arbitrary in a sense. Like you don't just take, oh, if it's arbitrary, therefore it's wrong. Well, it's not even wrong. It's not based, or it's an idea that's not based on anything. It's not even wrong.
Are you looking at this one? Sorry, is that what
No,
you're
I was
talking
thinking
about?
about a different way of analyzing words. Like we don't say the opposite. We don't say that coming up with a baseless idea is wrong. We say it's not even wrong because there's no way to judge it. So it's like beyond wrong. It's not just to say that when you're right, if you're not right, therefore you're wrong. You could also be not even wrong, which is even worse. Does that make sense?
Yes. That when you're talking about something that's outside of a standard.
Right.
Like you're
And in
talking,
a way, that's what substituting an emotion, that's an abandonment of even standards of thinking, I would say.
right. Okay. I gotta think more about that one too. I'm not sure what the responsibility of passing judgment was if that was independence. I think that was independence, but you can't permit yourself ever to evade the responsibility of passing judgment. But obviously I've got a very simple interpretation here, but I'm just trying to understand what would be the view, because you can't always pass judgment. There is a lot of times you have to say, I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like there's gotta be more context. Because my first thought is like, this isn't right. It isn't quite right.
Yeah.
I don't like it. Doesn't mean it's like, can I push yourself ever to evade the responsibility of passing judgment? I mean,
maybe when it conflicts with something that you know that's important, when it conflicts with something you know, that's when you have to. If it's well, actually, I don't know.
I mean, at least if you said that, I would say it's okay as long as you know why you're not convinced and just move on.
Yeah.
Like, don't be in a fog. It's like, oh, whatever. I have no idea. It's just like, well, I don't know about this fact, and I don't have time to think about it right now. But this is what's holding me back, or this is why I'm not willing to make a strong decision yet. And sometimes you do need to know more, and that's an honest judgment. But you need to know what it is you don't know, rather than just wave it off.
Okay. By the way, I just found something that we can throw in here. I'll just 1 second. Do you remember I asked you about, there was a quote by Harry Binswanger saying something like, when you act against a certain standard, you're building it into your soul, something like that. And I asked you about, is the mechanism there habit? And there was also a similar quote by Leonard Peikoff. I don't know if you remember. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Yeah. And then so I got a reply to that, and here's what they wrote. And it's not habit. It's not habits that form, it's values that are strengthened or weakened. So the example given was a white lie, which is, if you tell a white lie to someone, you establish lying into your soul. And I was like, okay, does that just mean my subconscious presents me with more options to lie next time? And like I do it, it's if I default and I act basically on my subconscious, whatever comes up in my subconscious, which you do in conversation, right? Then I will be more likely to lie. That was my question. They said, no, it's not habits. It's values that are strengthened or weakened. When you tell a white lie, you're weakening the value of honesty. A weaker value pops into mind less quickly. The next time you're tempted to tell a white lie, it may not occur to you that you should think about it because by a prior choice of action, you have downgraded honesty as not so important. Isn't that? I thought that's habit basically. I'm
To
not
me,
sure.
it is.
Yeah,
To
okay.
me, it's habit leads to that. The habit leads to the weaker value. That's how I understand it. That's what I was thinking or so. Then once you habituate the lack of importance, or it's just the different aspect of the same thing. The
Right.
value is the thing that is weakened. The habit is the means by which it is weakened.
Okay.
That's what I would say.
Okay. So the habits are the mechanism. The
That's what
end
I would say.
result is the values.
The formal cause, we could say, or the, well, don't use that, but it might be, yeah, by what means, by what agent. The what is it would be the value, for example. What is it? Or we could say the,
Out of what is it made? Subconscious something.
yeah, we could say that. By what agent? It could be you as an individual. For what end?
Well, isn't
You're
the agent
lying.
the habit, the mechanism of habit?
The cause
Maybe
of,
out of
well,
what
what
is
is it that's
out of what is
changing?
it made? It's made out of you. Well, actually, I don't
What
know.
is the thing that's changing? That's the what is it? What is changing?
The value,
I guess, yes, I guess we could say that. The value is changing out of what it is made.
subconscious connections.
I would say so.
I don't know.
Let me just,
This is hard to connect to this.
well, I'll just put it this way. The final cause would be for what purposes is changing. For the quality of your life, it's changing for the purpose of attaining action, long-term action. By what agent you're the, you could say by what formal cause. That would be the nature of habit. It's what changes that. What is it made? Yeah, I'm not sure how to use those
I'm
words,
not
but
sure.
the
Yeah.
idea is, so I'm just conveying, is that habit is the means by which the values change. There's a lot more I have on the causes, so I can add more to that later. But yeah,
Okay.
the means of changing is the habit. The
Got it.
values are what are changing. And you're the one doing it by your actions. You could say you're the self cause of it for the purpose of your life.
I guess they're both. I'm looking at my question now. I wrote this 2 months ago or so because there's a quote that I liked, which is, "You learn to bicycle by bicycling. You learn to courage by couraging." Something like that.
Yes, that is
Which,
true.
yeah. So that courage is both a knowledge and an act. Okay.
Yeah,
Cool. Let me
two
write again.
aspects of the same thing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. See, what I found difficult is, and this is why I asked you earlier about how did we get from rationality to all these different virtues, is because to me, I wouldn't have thought that integrity is assuming responsibility for the consequences of your own actions. Like that, to me, that is assuming responsibility for the consequences of my own actions. I wouldn't have integrated that with integrity if I'm just going by common sense. Um,
Um, I mean, How would I answer that? I would need to reread the objectives ethics again to
Yeah,
see
okay.
where she uses that in context.
This is all from the Vision.
Yeah.
That's okay. I'll skip it for now.
Or yeah.
Yeah, like even this, like how do you even get to this where you say and you get to a generalization where this helps, like if you disagree with someone, just saying an I do not agree is somehow good. Like I don't know how you get from rationality to this, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
As an example, like I have a lot of friends who are vegan and I love them, but they'll often say like I'm ethical about the way I eat my food, or like basically the implication is that everyone who's not vegan is unethical. And I definitely don't agree with that. And so that's one example. There's probably more. I even wrote some down, but I think this one is enough. But my question is, yeah, it's like how I don't get how you know that rationality requires you to go, I do not agree with that. I'm not going to discuss it, but I don't agree. Like, it's just, how does that, it's not clear that that is somehow helpful to me, is what I'm saying. Like, how do you get from, okay, use your mind, to suddenly tell everyone you don't agree with them when they say something?
Well, I think it's an aspect of judgment and recognizing that, well, this is actually one of the things I never quite understood why Rand
Okay.
really
Good. I'm
tried
going to
to
write
say
about it.
these things. Like, I know Rand would say like, oh, it's okay not to say I don't agree with you, but very often she took it personally when somebody said something she disagreed with. Like, so I'm not really sure why she wanted to like say like it's okay to say you do not agree, but she went pretty hard when people didn't agree.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure why she did that. I mean, to me, it would seem like it should just be derived from the fact that, I mean, you want to be understood, but it doesn't seem like she would ever argue that. I mean, the rational thing to me would be that you should say, I do not agree with you, because it's an aspect of judgment of using your mind in an active way, in a way that interacts with people. You're not just a passive recipient, that you're actually part of the lives of others, that your values are interacting, and that you can engage in thoughts. I think that's kind of what I would argue through the value of conveying your thoughts with people who are also equally willing to hear some thoughts, that you should express your judgments to exchange ideas, that is beneficial for everyone in the long run to hear each other out.
This actually makes me think of the whole thread I wrote about principles, because it's similar in that it's hard to show. You'd need to concretize somehow that this is a really good approach to living, as opposed to, like, what you said makes sense to me. But again, I often experience, I can read something and I'm like, yeah, this follows from that, follows from this. But okay, show me that it actually works in reality, which is like a different thing. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Why does it work in reality? I wish Rand would give more of those examples sometimes.
You know, it's interesting because I told you about Ray Dalio, who runs Bridgewater.
Yes.
I did? Yeah.
Let's see if I
and he talks about, so he gives a lot of principles in his books. But he talks about, let's see if I can find a little photo that's good. I can't find one, but I'll just tell you. So he speaks about, not explicitly, but he does say that you can't just take over my principles. They're based on the things that I've seen and learned. And so you need to find out for yourself, basically, before you get to these condensations, something like that. And Naval Ravikant, who's another guy, he was a venture capitalist, and he writes a lot on wealth and mindset and science now. He said something similar. And I think it's the case here, like with all these abstract condensations of generalizations, which is what principles are. You need to go through a process. Like I can communicate with you and give you the logic of the argument, like you just gave me now. You try to make a logical argument for it, and it works. But then it's up to the person individually to then make all the concrete observations that lead him to go, okay, this generalization is true.
Yeah. I think part of that is the field of rhetoric, which Rand is good about the logical end of things, but she didn't really have a theory of rhetoric, I think. Or the way of persuading.
Sorry, explain that to me. Part of what is the theory of rhetoric?
Rhetoric.
Part of what
Persuasion
is?
generally.
Oh, okay. Like
means of persuasion.
Okay, so communicating ideas would be another way to say it.
Yeah, and there would be like putting the person in the right receptive state of mind and stating things in a way that are relevant and important to them emotionally.
Right.
And then the logical argument would, but that's what Rand does really well.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of phrases like this, and I'm like, okay, these are all just statements to me. Like, why is this true? To work at less than your capacity. And so I'm reading this, and I'm like, okay, here's what he says productiveness is, but why? I don't get it. Like, why does he say this? And I often experience that reading. It just seems like all these statements from the clouds that arrive and tell you this is bad, this is good, but okay, why?
Fulfillment of your nature, which I don't think Peikoff emphasizes quite enough.
Okay.
I think it always just emphasizes by your nature that you do these things, you're living up to the actions required of the actions of your nature. You're actualizing your nature. You're working in the manner that you are meant to towards your purpose.
Got it.
And that's why, like, it's productiveness is living that purpose. Productiveness is that way of being your nature, not just going through the motions, but the way of living it out.
Okay, I get that. That makes sense.
By the way, as far as the 4 causes, I wouldn't worry too much about the terms, just the idea of splitting things up into different causes that might be relevant to each other, not just what is more important, just rather what are the way things are interacting. If we looked at habit and value, well, is there an interaction? Is it one that's more important? Is one thing irrelevant? In what way do they work together? Things like that.
Right. I'd still need to work through examples, right? Because it's when I just look at the 4 causes, I don't know what the hell's going on.
Yeah,
it's hard to
do more of them. I'm noticing more of them too every time I think about them. I'll get it eventually too. It's new to me as well.
That's good. It's perfect because then when I go through it, I can ask you a million questions and then you can gain something from it too. All right.
See, I mean, that's kind of what I do sometimes. Like, I start using it, then it's like, wait, I'm fumbling over it. I don't quite get it yet. Even though I started to, it's like, oh, it's starting to make sense now. The habit is like a formal cause. Then you realize, wait, that's not quite it. But it's better understanding than I had before.
And then questions come up too. I think that's the...
Yes.
Okay, let's see this next. Similarly, it is an action. It is, I'll let you read it. I'll read it separately.
Yeah.
I really like this. I like the way he often writes and integrates like day-to-day psychology and like not to have long-range purposes, to be motivated by the phone calls of the moment. That's great. I like it.
Yeah, this is a good quote. This one explains it well. Yes, I think includes creation of character.
Right.
Values of the mind.
Okay, cool. What does it mean makes control over one's existence possible? That's fairly abstract. Like, in a sense, everyone has control over one's existence. But what does he mean here when he says a long range goal that unifies and integrates your actions makes control over your? Oh, okay, I get it. I think because to the extent that you are unified and integrated, you have control over more of your existence versus if you're not, then there are aspects of your life that, as he says, are motivated by chance, feelings, invitations, and Facebook
Yes.
messages of the moment.
Yes.
Okay,
Sounds
cool.
right.
Very cool.